Along the silent roads of Suffolk, bodies began to appear, each one a message no one can decipher. As the darkness tightens its grip, whispers of a faceless killer spread, leaving a community trapped between fear and the unknown. Hear the entire story over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. Now enjoy the stories. Hola, Joel. My name is Maria, and although I think I'm a little older than your usual crowd, I think my story is just as scary as any other. Back when I was just 21 years young, I went on a date with a guy in my home state of Florida. Since it was our first date, I felt nervous as hell just sitting across from this guy I'd met at a friend's party a week earlier. His name was Roddy, short for Rodrigo, and he seemed really nice. He had a cute smile, he was kind of shy, and he worked at a record store downtown. This was 1983, and Miami was buzzing, and I was excited for our first date at this little Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. I'd never been there before, but everyone said the food was amazing and it had this cozy vibe with colorful tiles and old photos on the walls. Roddy picked me up at my apartment and we drove to the restaurant in his beat-up Chevy, and I wanted to make a good impression, but I was already second-guessing everything by the time I got there. The air was warm and sticky. It was typical Miami, and the radio played some new wave song that I pretended to like. And I just remember fidgeting with my bracelet, trying to calm my nerves. And then when we walked into the restaurant, the smell of roasted pork and fresh coffee hit me, and I started to relax a little. The place was packed. Families were laughing and waiters rushing around, and we got a small table near the window, and I remember thinking how the streetlights outside made everything just feel alive. We ordered some food, and I was just starting to feel like maybe this date wouldn't be a disaster. Roddy was telling me about some vinyl he'd found at work, and I was trying to act interested even though I wasn't big into music. I sipped my soda and I glanced out the window every now and then. The street was busy, with cars cruising by and people walking under the neon signs, and everything felt normal, like any other night in Miami, and then it happened. I didn't even realize what was going on at first. There was this loud pop, like firecrackers, and the window next to us shattered. Glass sprayed everywhere and I froze, my heart pounding harder than I'd ever felt before. The pops kept coming, fast and sharp, and people started screaming. I ducked under a table, my hands over my head, not even thinking, just moving on instinct. I could feel bits of glass under my palms. My dress was probably ruined, but I didn't care. All I could think was, please God, I don't want to die. And Roddy was under the table with me, and his face I remember being pale as a ghost. I could hear plates crashing, chairs scraping, and more screams. The gunfire kept coming, but it wasn't like in the movies. It was messy, chaotic, so loud that my ears were ringing, and I kept waiting for it to stop, but it felt like forever. I was shaking. My breath was coming in these short gasps, and I couldn't stop picturing someone bursting through the door to finish us off. I didn't know what was happening or why it was happening. All I knew was that I was terrified. When the shooting finally stopped, it was like the world held its breath. There was this terrible silence at first, one that was eventually broken by people crying or shouting in Spanish. I stayed under the table, too scared to move. Roddy grabbed my hand, and even though it felt weirdly intimate for a first date, I let him. But my mind was racing. Were we safe? Was the shooter gone? Or was he just waiting for round two? I kept thinking about my mom, how I hadn't called her that day, and how I might never get the chance ever again. And somehow, I think it was a waiter, yelled that everything was over, and for everyone to stay calm. I peeked out from under the table. The restaurant was a mess. There were tables flipped over, food spilled everywhere, glass glittering on the floor like little razor-sharp pieces of confetti. People were huddled together, some crying, others checking on each other. I saw an older woman holding a napkin to her arm with blood seeping through and staining the white fabric. But thankfully, that was the worst injury I saw. Nobody seemed to be dead, and although I felt a wave of relief, My body wouldn't stop shaking. Roddy helped me to my feet, and for a few seconds we just stood there looking around and not knowing what to do. The air smelled like something burning and spilled coffee. My ears were still ringing, my legs felt like jelly. I noticed my dress had a tear at the hem, and for some reason, that there made me want to cry. It was such a stupid thing to care about when I just thought that I was about to die, but all of it just kind of hit me really hard. I kept thinking it was supposed to be a fun night, but somehow it turned into a nightmare. Police sirens started wailing outside, and soon there were cops everywhere asking questions and telling us to stay put. I heard someone say it was a Cuban dissident, someone angry about politics who shot up the place to make a point. They didn't want to kill anyone, they just wanted to wreck the restaurant. And I didn't understand any of it. Why that place? Why that night? I felt this weird mix of relief that no one was seriously hurt, but also an anger that someone could be so evil as to ruin a normal night and put people's lives at risk, all for nothing more than politics. And before we left, me and Roddy gave our statements to the police. I don't even remember what I said. My mind was foggy, but once we were done, they told us we could leave. Roddy offered to drive me and I nodded, still too shaken to argue and not wanting to be alone. We didn't talk much on the way back. The radio was off and the city felt different, like it had shown me a side that I didn't want to see. When we got to my apartment, I just sat in his car for a minute, not ready to be alone. He asked me if I was okay and I said yeah, even though I clearly wasn't. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the sound of the gunfire and the way the glass exploded, the way my heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I kept thinking about how I'd been so worried about my hair or whether Roddy liked me, and then the world turned upside down in a second. It made everything feel so fragile, like anything could happen at any time. Roddy called the next day to check on me, and we talked a little about what happened. We went out again a week later, but it wasn't the same. The spark was gone, maybe because we'd shared something so intense too soon, and I didn't blame him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the date had been doomed from the start. The restaurant stayed closed for a while, and I never went back, even after it reopened. I couldn't imagine sitting there again, eating like nothing had happened. And for a long time I got nervous in crowded places. Every loud noise made me jump, and I'd see a car backfire, hear a door slam, and feel that same panic in my chest. I started avoiding Little Havana altogether, which was silly because it wasn't the neighborhood's fault. I just couldn't handle the memories. But over time, things got better. I went on other dates and laughed and felt normal again. But obviously that night stuck with me like a scar that you forget about until you catch a glimpse of it. It was the night that I learned how quickly everything can change and how you can plan for a perfect evening and end up hiding underneath a table, praying you'll make it out alive. So I've been a listener for a while and I love your stories, and I think that you might like to read one of mine which involves my terrible dating life. His name was Jay and we'd matched on an app. He seemed confident, maybe a bit cocky, but in a charming way. He was a dude from a rough part of town, always posting about his souped-up car and flashy sneakers on social media. Hood rich, I guess you could call it. Big attitude, bigger dreams, but probably not much in his bank account. Still, he had a vibe and I was curious. He suggested we go for a drive, maybe grab some food somewhere low-key, and it sounded fun, so I said yes. I've been looking forward to the date for days. I got ready that evening, keeping it simple, jeans, a cute top, some sneakers in case we ended up walking somewhere, and Jay pulled up outside my flat in this really loud and shiny car. The thing was decked out with tinted windows, had some low suspension, and a very bass-heavy sound system that actually rattled the windows before I even stepped outside. And he leaned out the driver's side window, kinda smiling, and I hopped in. And the car smelled like air freshener and this leather polish. He was wearing a tracksuit, all designer and a gold chain that looked heavier than it needed to be. I thought he was trying a bit hard, but I guess I didn't mind. He seemed excited to show off. And we drove through the city, music was blaring, and I was having a decent time. Jay was chatty, telling me about his car and how he'd saved up for the mods and how he'd been in a few street races. I wasn't actually sure if he was exaggerating, but I just kind of nodded along. And the streets were busy, lights were flashing, and I was starting to relax and thinking this might actually be a fun night. And he asked if I wanted to see what the car could do, and I just shrugged, thinking he'd just rev the engine or something. But that was a big mistake. We pulled onto a quieter road, and Jay's whole vibe changed. His smile got wider, and he started driving faster, way faster. The speedometer climbed, and my stomach flipped as the car roared. I gripped the seat, trying to play it cool, but I was clearly nervous. I didn't say anything, though. I didn't want to seem boring. And he was weaving through traffic, cutting corners, and I could feel the car vibrating underneath me. And I kept thinking that he'd slow down, but he didn't. And then I heard it. Sirens behind us. At first I thought it was just an ambulance maybe, but Jay's face got excited. He glanced in the rearview mirror and swore under his breath. I turned around and saw these flashing lights behind us, and my heart sank. Police, 2 cars, maybe 3 right on our tail. I asked what was going on, but Jay didn't answer. He just floored it. And the car pushed forward, and I was just pinned in my seat. We were flying now, way over the speed limit, dodging other cars like something out of a movie. My hands were sweaty and my chest was feeling tight. I wanted to scream at him to stop, but my voice was just stuck, like a dream. The sirens were louder, closer, and I could see the police cars in the side mirror, and their lights were blinding me. Jay was focused, hands gripping the wheel, but I could tell that he was panicking too. The city started to blur past. Street lights, buildings, everything just looked like a streak, and I didn't know where we were anymore. We hit this long stretch of road, and I thought that maybe we might actually lose them, but the police didn't stop. I heard a loud bang, and the car swerved hard. My head slammed against the window, and I remember yelling. Jay shouted something, but I couldn't make it out over the noise. I looked back and saw one of the police cars had rammed us. The rear of that BMW was crumpled and the back windshield was cracked. I realized later it was one of those pit maneuvers that I'd seen on TV where they hit your car and try to make it spin out, and if you asked me, it worked a little bit too well. The car started to skid, the tires were screeching, and we spun across the road before coming to a stop. I was shaking, my ears were ringing from the impact. Before I could process what was happening, there was another crash, and glass exploded everywhere. The driver's side window was suddenly gone, shattered by something heavy, maybe a baton, I have no idea. I just remember screaming, covering my face as those shards started to rain into the car. My window was the next to smash, and I felt the air rush in. I looked up and there were police everywhere, surrounding us. The cars were angled to block us in, lights flashing so bright that it was hurting my eyes, and I saw guns. Actual guns, not just like stun guns, pointed right at me through the broken windows. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might explode. I froze, hands up trying to show that I wasn't a threat. Jay was yelling, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. The police were shouting too, telling us to get out with our hands up. And I was terrified, but I managed to open the door and stumble out. The road was cold under my feet, and I realized that I'd lost a shoe somewhere in the chaos. My hands were trembling as I held them above my head and kept my eyes down, too scared to even look at the officers. They grabbed me, not roughly but firmly, and pulled me away from the car. I saw them drag Jay out, pinning him to the ground. He was still shouting, something about how they had no right, but they weren't listening. I was led to the side of the road where an officer started asking me questions. They wanted to know my name, what I was doing, if I knew why Jay ran. And I told them it was our first date, that I had no idea what was going on. My voice was shaky, and I felt tears filling up in my eyes, but I held it together. The police searched me, checked my bag while I stood there, shivering and humiliated while cars slowed down and their passengers were just staring at us. And the police kept me there for what felt like forever, asking the same questions over and over. And I told them I barely knew Jay, that I'd literally just met him online, but I could tell they didn't fully believe me. They said the car was flagged for something, It was stolen maybe, or linked to a crime. I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. All I could think about was how I'd ended up here on the side of the road, surrounded by cops with guns, all because I thought a drive with a guy might be fun. And eventually they let me go. They didn't arrest me, thank God, but they took my details and said they might call later. Obviously, Jay wasn't so lucky. He got cuffed and shoved into the back of a police van, and I didn't stick around to see what happened next. One of the officers drove me home, and I sat in the back of the car staring out the window. When I got to my place, I locked the door, sank onto the couch, and just sat there trying to process everything. My phone was blowing up with texts and calls from friends, and they were most probably wondering how the date went, but I honestly couldn't bring myself to answer. I eventually deleted Jay's number, unmatched him on the app, and swore that I'd never go on a date ever again. All I wanted was a fun night out, and instead, I got to experience what it was like to pretty much play Grand Theft Auto in real life. I'd been excited about my date with Alexei. He was a handsome Greek boy, successful and wealthy, and everything that sounded perfect on paper. We met through a mutual friend who said he was a great catch, and when he asked me out to lunch, I thought it could be fun. I got ready and headed to the fancy restaurant that he'd picked out. It was one of those places with white tablecloths and waiters who kind of hovered, and I felt a little out of my element, but I was ready to give it a chance. And the date started off okay. Alexei showed up in a sleek car wearing a tailored suit, and he had this confident smile that made me think he was used to getting his way. We sat down and I noticed that he didn't even look at the menu before ordering for both of us. Now, I thought it was a bit odd, but I let it slide, figuring that he just wanted to take charge. The food came quickly and I tried to make small talk, asking about his work and his hobbies, and he answered in short, clipped sentences like he was too important to bother with details. It felt like he was sizing me up instead of actually listening. And then I noticed how he treated the waiter. When the guy brought the wrong wine, Alexei snapped at him. His voice was sharp and cold, saying that he shouldn't have to explain himself to someone who couldn't do their job right. The waiter apologized, but Alexei kept going, calling him incompetent with this low, cutting tone. And I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't just impatience, it was cruel. I tried to change the subject, but Alexei barely acknowledged me, like I was just there to fill a seat. He rushed through the meal, checked his watch every few minutes, and when the bill came, he tossed his credit card down without even looking at it. I offered to split it just to be polite, but he waved me off, saying it was nothing. By the end of lunch, I knew that I didn't want to see him again. His controlling vibe, the way he treated people, it was a hard pass, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make a scene, and honestly, I just wanted to get home. My car was in the shop, so I'd taken a cab to the restaurant. When Alexei offered to drive me home, I hesitated, but it was a long way back and I didn't have much cash for another cab. I figured that I could handle a short ride, smile, and say goodbye forever. We got into his car and at first it seemed fine. He asked for my address and I gave it to him, expecting a quick trip. But as we drove, I noticed that he wasn't heading toward my neighborhood. The city streets turned into quieter roads and then into winding country lanes with nothing but fields and trees. I asked where he was going, trying to keep my voice calm, but he just sort of smirked and said he was taking a scenic route. And at that point, my heart started pounding. Now, this was well before cell phones, so I had no way of calling anyone, no way to tell anyone where I was. I was just alone with some guy, and the further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The countryside stretched out, empty and endless. No houses, no gas stations, just open fields and the occasional barn. I kept my eyes on the road trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking. I asked again, more firmly, to take me home. Alexei's demeanor changed. His voice got low and he said he'd figured me out. He thought I'd used him for a free lunch, that I'd played him by letting him pay and acting like I was interested when I had no intention of seeing him again. He said I'd wasted his time and his gas money, like I'd tricked him on purpose. I tried to explain that I hadn't meant to mislead him, that I just didn't feel a connection, but he wasn't listening. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He looked at me, his eyes were very hard, and he said he could drive me deeper into the middle of nowhere. He said he could do whatever he wanted, and no one would find me for days, maybe weeks. And my whole body seized up. I didn't know if he was serious or just trying to scare me, but at that moment, I believed he could do it. I was trapped in his car, miles from anywhere, with no way to get help. And I felt so small, so helpless, and I started begging him to take me home. My voice was shaking, trying to keep him calm. I told him I was sorry, that I didn't mean to upset him, anything to get him to turn the car around. He didn't say much after that. He just kept driving, his hands tight on the wheel, while I sat there, my heart racing, watching the empty fields roll by. I kept thinking about how no one knew where I was, how I'd made a mistake getting into his car. I thought about my family, my friends, and how I might not see them again if this went wrong. It felt like hours, though it was probably less, before he finally turned the car around. He didn't say why, didn't explain. He just started heading back toward town, and I didn't dare say anything to risk changing his mind. When we finally pulled into my neighborhood, I felt like I could breathe again, but I was still shaking. He stopped in front of my apartment and I reached for the door handle, desperate to get out. Before I could, he grabbed my arm, looked me in the eye and said that he could have done anything to me out there, and no one would have stopped him. He said I should remember that. And then he let go, and I stumbled out of the car, barely able to stand. I didn't look back as he drove off. I just ran inside, locked the door, and sat there trying to process what had happened. I reported it to the police the next day. I was scared, but I couldn't let it go. I told them everything, how he'd driven me out to the countryside, what he'd said, and how he'd made me feel like my life was in his hands. They brought him in, but Alexei told a completely different story. He'd said he'd just driven me home like I'd asked, and that he'd taken a longer route because he wanted to talk and that I was overreacting. He played it off like I was some dramatic girl making a big deal out of nothing. The cops listened to both of us, but there wasn't much evidence, just my word against his. In the end, they let him go with a warning. I was furious, but I wasn't surprised. He was rich, charming when he wanted to be, and he knew how to spin a yarn. The way that he made me feel so powerless. I started double-checking my locks at night, looking over my shoulder when I walked home. I never saw Alexei again, and I was grateful for that. But the whole thing left a mark. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a reminder of how quickly things can turn, how someone can seem perfect on the outside and still be dangerous. I learned to trust my gut after that, to listen when something feels off, and I never let anyone drive me home again unless I was absolutely sure that I could trust them. My name's Camille, and I'll be honest, my dating history was a mess. I've been on dating apps for a while, swiping through profiles, hoping to find someone different. I always seem to end up with the same kind of guys, though. Mean, rough, and if I'm being honest, sometimes violent. A lot of them were into some pretty edgy stuff, like drug dealing, or they were MMA fighters with egos that were bigger than their biceps, and I was pretty much tired of it at that point. I wanted something better, someone who wasn't like that. So when I matched with this one guy, we'll just call him Tom, I actually felt a spark of hope. And his profile seemed normal. He had a steady job, liked hiking, and didn't come off like he was trying to prove anything. We started chatting, and he was kind and funny even. I told myself this could be a fresh start. We texted for a couple of weeks, and I opened up a bit about my past. Not everything, but enough to let him know that I'd been with some bad guys and was trying to move past that phase of my life. And he didn't judge, which was nice. He listened, asked questions, and seemed to get it. And eventually we decided to meet up. I suggested a place on the outer limits of the city, a quiet little pub that I'd been to once or twice. It wasn't exactly fancy, but it was far enough from my usual haunts that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. Or so I thought. I got to the pub and grabbed a table near the back. Tom showed up right on time, and he looked just like he did in his pictures. Average height, brown hair, very kind eyes. And he smiled when he saw me, and I relaxed a little. We ordered some drinks and started talking, and it was easy, just like our text messages. We talked about his job, my love for old music, and random stuff like favorite places to eat. And it felt good, like maybe I'd finally met someone who wasn't completely toxic. And about an hour in, Tom excused himself to use the toilet. I stayed at the table sipping my drink and feeling pretty hopeful. I was thinking about how maybe this could work, how maybe I could leave my old life behind. But when Tom came back, he seemed a bit off. Not upset, just sort of distracted. I asked if everything was okay, but he brushed it off and said it was nothing. I didn't push him though. We just kept talking, but I could tell that something had definitely shifted. He wasn't as relaxed anymore, and I wondered if I'd said something wrong, but I couldn't think of anything. We finished our drinks and decided to call it a night. It was getting late and the pub was starting to empty out. Tom offered to drive me home, which I appreciated. I didn't live too far, but it was nice not to have to take a bus or call a cab. We walked out to his car, parked in a dimly lit lot behind the pub, and the air was chilly and I pulled my jacket even tighter. And that's when I noticed a group of people hanging around near the edge of the lot. They looked pretty rough, skinny, twitchy, like they hadn't slept in days. I knew that look. I'd seen it too many times before. I grabbed Tom's arm and whispered that we should hurry. And he nodded and we picked up the pace. But before we could get to his car, the group started moving towards us. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, and I recognized one of them, a guy named Johnny, and he used to hang around with one of my exes, a dealer who had been bad news from the start. I hadn't seen Johnny in years, but I knew that he was trouble. I didn't say anything to Tom, I just wanted to get out of there. They got to us before we could reach the car, though. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head, started shouting, asking who Tom was and why he was with me. Tom tried to stay calm, saying that we were just leaving, but they weren't having it. They started circling us, and I saw one of them pull out a crowbar. Tom grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the car, but they weren't letting us go that easily. The guy with the crowbar swung at the car, smashing the side mirror. Another one kicked the door, leaving a dent, and I screamed, and Tom yelled at them to back off, but that just made them laugh. Tom unlocked his car finally, and we jumped in. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the seatbelt. The group was still banging on the car, shouting, but Tom didn't wait. He started the engine and peeled out of that lot. I remember the tires screeching. I looked back and saw them standing there, still yelling something, but thankfully they didn't follow us. My heart was racing and I could barely breathe. I kept saying that I was sorry, over and over, like it was my fault. Tom didn't say much, just kept his eyes on the road. The drive to my place was quiet, and I felt awful. I knew these guys were probably connected to my past, and I hated that Tom had gotten caught up in that. I kept thinking about how I'd wanted this to be different, how I'd wanted to leave all of that stuff behind, but I guess it followed me anyway. When we got to my flat, I turned to Tom and apologized again. I told him I didn't know those guys would be there and that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He was kind about it, said it wasn't my fault, but I could tell that he was shaken. His car was messed up and he'd just been through something very terrifying because of me. And before I got out of the car, Tom said he'd like to see me again. And I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could try again, that this was just a bad night. And I smiled and said that I'd like that too. I went inside, still feeling shaky but holding on to a tiny bit of hope. Maybe he meant it. Maybe we could get past this. But a few days later I texted him and he didn't reply. I waited a couple of more days and tried again. Nothing. I checked the app and he'd unmatched me. I realized that he must have deleted my number and it hurt, but I couldn't blame him. That night was a nightmare and I knew it was because of me, because of the mess that I'd been trying to escape. I sat on my couch, staring at my phone, feeling like I'd ruined my chance at something good. I'd wanted so badly to change, to find someone who wasn't part of that world. But it felt like my past was never going to let me go. I thought about reaching out again, maybe explaining more, but I didn't. I figured he'd made his choice and I had to respect that. And I felt embarrassed, ashamed even, if I should have picked a different place or told him more about my past up front, but it was done. All I could do was try and move forward, keep trying to leave that old life behind, and I told myself that I'd be more careful next time if there was a next time. I just hoped that one day I'd meet someone who could see past the mess and give me a real chance. I'd been looking forward to that date like a kid looking forward to Christmas. When he asked me out, I felt a little flutter in my stomach, and he seemed like a charming old-fashioned gentleman with a warm smile and a way of being that made me feel like he was really listening and not just waiting for his turn to speak. So we'd met through a mutual friend, and after a few texts back and forth, he suggested that we grab dinner and take a walk on the beach. It sounded perfect, like something out of a movie. I spent a while picking out my outfit, which ended up being a simple sundress. Nothing too fancy, but nice enough to feel good about myself. And I was nervous but excited, hoping that this could be a start to something. And the evening started great. We went to this little seafood place near the shore. It was cozy with string lights and the smell of fried shrimp in the air. And we talked about everything. Movies, music, our favorite places to hang out. And he was easy to talk to, and I felt comfortable, like I could be myself. He told stories about growing up, his old dog, and some of the dumb stuff he did as a kid. I laughed a lot, and he seemed to enjoy making me smile. After dinner, we decided to walk along the beach. The sun was setting, and it was kind of painting the sky this orange and pink, and the waves were calm, lapping up at the shore. It felt romantic, like we were in our own little Disney world. We walked side by side, our shoes were off, sand cool between my toes, and I was happy, thinking that maybe this was someone I could really like. We talked about random things at first, how he liked surfing, how I'd always wanted to try it. But then, it seemed like the conversation just sort of shifted. He started talking about his family, his parents mostly, and I listened, interested in learning more about him, and that's when he said it, so casually, like it was no big deal. How sometimes his dad used to hit his mom. And my stomach dropped. I stopped walking for a second, thinking that I must have heard him wrong, but he kept going, saying that it didn't seem to hurt their relationship and that it was just how things were sometimes. Now my heart started racing, and not in a good romantic way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'd grown up in a house where my parents never laid a hand on each other no matter how mad they got, so the idea that a man was hitting a woman, especially for something as small as talking back, made me feel physically sick. And I couldn't stay quiet. I told him I didn't agree, that no real man would ever hit a woman just for speaking her mind. I wasn't trying to start a fight, I just couldn't let that slide, because it felt wrong to nod along like it was okay. I thought he'd maybe explain himself or say that he didn't mean it like that, but his face changed, and his eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. I could tell he was mad, but I didn't expect what came next. Before I knew it, he was yelling about how I was insulting his dad, how I didn't know what I was talking about. I tried to stay calm, to backtrack a little, but he refused to listen to me. And then he grabbed my arm, so hard that it hurt, and I froze. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs couldn't move. He gave me a sharp slap across my face that stung and made my eyes water. I stumbled back, shocked, trying to process what was happening. This guy I'd been laughing with for an hour ago was now hitting me. He didn't stop. He grabbed me again, and I felt another blow, this time to my shoulder from a closed fist. And pain shot through me, and I started to panic. I tried to push him away, but he was stronger. And I was scared, really scared, and all I could think was that I needed to get away. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe just a few seconds, maybe a whole minute, but it felt like forever. My face was throbbing and my arm hurt where he grabbed me, and I was crying and trying to shield myself when suddenly I heard shouting. Not from him, but from other people. Suddenly there were footsteps in the sand and a group of strangers appeared out of nowhere. They were yelling at him to stop, pulling him off of me. And I fell to my knees, shaking, trying to catch my breath. There were 3 or 4 of them, I think, and within seconds they were between us and keeping us separate. One of them, a woman, knelt beside me asking if I was okay, and I couldn't answer. I was too shaken up, my mind racing with what had just happened. The guy was yelling at the group, cursing and trying to push past them. I looked up and saw him struggling, his face all twisted with anger. I was terrified he'd come back for me, but the people held him back, telling him to leave. Someone mentioned calling the cops, and that's when he bolted. He ran down the beach, disappearing into the dark. And I just sat there, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of something I'd never make sense of. The woman stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, telling me that I was safe now. Another guy was on his phone, talking to the police and giving them a description of what had happened. My face hurt and I could feel a bruise forming on my arm, and I was embarrassed, scared, and angry all at once. And I kept thinking about how fast everything had changed. One minute we were having a great date, and the next he was hitting me. And I felt stupid for not seeing it coming, but for thinking he was a good guy. The woman helped me stand, and I realized that I was still crying. She was kind, telling me it wasn't my fault and that I didn't do anything to deserve this. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me was blaming myself for saying anything about his dad. A couple of police officers showed up a little while later. I was sitting on a bench near the beach, wrapped in a jacket one of the strangers had given me. The officer asked me what happened, and I told him everything, from the dinner to the walk to what he said about his parents. And it was hard to talk about, especially with my face still stinging and my hands were still shaking. They asked for his name, his number, and anything I knew about him, and I gave them what I could, but I didn't know much. We'd literally only just met. And they'd said they'd try to find him, but since he ran off, it might take some time, and I just remember nodding and feeling very numb. The woman who stayed with me offered to drive me home, and I didn't want to be alone, so I accepted. And on the way, I felt betrayed, not just by him, but by my own judgment. I thought that he was someone I could trust. And when I got home, I locked the doors and just sat on my couch, still sitting in my nice dress, staring at the wall. My phone was full of notifications, but I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to talk to anyone. Because that night changed me. I felt less trusting, more guarded, and I kept thinking about his face and how it went from warm and kind to that just cold and angry look so fast. I had bruises for days, reminders of what had happened, but more than the physical pain, it was the shock that stuck with me. I'd gone on a date hoping for something good, and instead I ended up scared and hurt. The police called a few times after that, but they never were able to get in contact with this guy, and I honestly don't know if they ever will. All I know is that I'll never forget that night, and I'll never look at a first date the same way again. I was 22, just out of college, and working at a little coffee shop downtown. He'd come in a few times, always ordering the same black coffee and flashing his smile that always made my stomach jump. He was cute, tall, and had messy brown hair with this quiet confidence that really wasn't cocky. And when he finally asked me out for dinner, I said yes before I could even finish the sentence. And that Friday night, I spent way too long getting ready. Stephen picked me up at my apartment and we went to this nice little Italian place. It was perfect, it had dim lights, good pasta, and conversation that flowed like we'd known each other forever. And we talked about music, our favorite movies, and how he was saving up to travel. And after dinner, we weren't ready to call it a night. Stephen suggested hitting a club a few blocks away, and I was all in. I loved dancing, and the idea of getting loose with him sounded pretty fun. And the club was packed, the music was loud, and the lights were flashing in a way that kind of makes you feel like you're in a different world. And we danced for hours, laughing and sipping on some overpriced drinks, and I was having the time of my life, feeling free and maybe even a little reckless in the best kind of way. And that's when we came across Dan. He came right up to us on the dance floor, very charming and very full of cocky confidence. He seemed to be older, maybe in his late 30s, and he had this slicked-back hair and a smile that was probably too perfect. And he introduced himself as Dan, but everyone called him Hot Tub Dan. And I didn't think much of that weird nickname at the time. It sounded kind of quirky, like something you'd hear in a college town. And he told us he was throwing an after-party at his place and invited us to come along. A few other people around us overheard and got excited, and before I knew it, there were maybe 6 or 7 of us piling into Ubers and heading to this Hot Tub Dan's house. And I was excited. The night felt like some kind of adventure, and I wasn't ready for it to end. Steven seemed a little hesitant, but we just brushed it off. I figured he was just being overly cautious, and I was having too much fun to really overthink anything, being young and naive. Now we pull up to Hot Tub Dan's place, and my jaw dropped. It was huge. A modern 2-story house with big windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. It looked like something out of a magazine, and inside it was even more impressive. Everything was sleek and expensive looking, with a massive living room and a bar stocked with every kind of liquor, and sliding glass doors that opened to a backyard with, you guessed it, a hot tub. And the party kicked off fast. Someone cranked up the music and people started pouring some drinks, and Dan was honestly the perfect host. Always making sure everyone had a drink in their hand, always smiling and really quick with his jokes. I got caught up in the energy of everything. The hot tub was obviously a big hit. People were jumping in, laughing, splashing around. I didn't get in, but I was honestly just having a blast dancing and chatting with other people. Most of them were around my age, a mix of guys and gals who'd all ended up at Dan's place after the club. And everything seemed nice and the vibe felt carefree, like we were all just chasing a good time. Steven, though, was acting very differently. He stayed close to me, but he wasn't as into it as I was. He wasn't dancing much, and he kept looking around like he was kind of sizing things up. I noticed him watching Dan a few times, but I really didn't think much of it. I was just too busy with myself, I guess. And at around 2 a.m., I was still going strong, sipping drinks and laughing with some of the girls that I met. And that's when Steven leaned in and said we should head out. I was surprised. It was late, sure, but the party was still in full swing. I told him I wanted to stay a little longer, but he was firm about it. He said he was tired and didn't feel like sticking around. I was a little annoyed, honestly, and thought that he was being a buzzkill, but he insisted, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of everything, so we called a taxi and left. And the ride home was quiet. I was still riding the high of the night, but Steven seemed distracted. He didn't say much, just kind of looked out the window. And I figured he was just tired or maybe not as into partying as I was. And when we got to my place, he walked me to my door, gave me a quick hug, and said he'd text me tomorrow. I went to bed, still buzzing from the night, thinking about everything and all the fun that I'd had. It had been such a fun and wild night, and I was already looking forward to telling my friends about it. The next morning, I woke up to my phone ringing. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, it was the police. And my stomach dropped. They asked if I'd been at a house party the night before, and I said yes, confused. They wanted me to come to the station to answer some questions, and I didn't know what was going on. But I got dressed and went, and my mind was racing the whole way there. Had something happened after we left? Was someone hurt? I had no idea, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that something seriously messed up had occurred. At the station, the officers were kind but clearly serious. They sat me down and started asking about the party, stuff like when did I get there, who was I with, and what had I seen. Then and only then did they tell me why they'd called. A girl at the party had been, for lack of better words, intimately assaulted. It happened after Steven and I left in the early hours of the morning. They didn't give me too many details, but they said it was bad. Dan, the guy who owned the house, was the one who did it. My heart sank as they talked. I thought about how I'd been at that house in that hot tub backyard, laughing and dancing just hours before it happened. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut, as it could have been me. They asked if I'd noticed anything off about Dan, anything that stood out. I told them that I hadn't. He seemed charming and friendly, like the kind of guy who just loved throwing parties and socializing. I mentioned how he'd been so welcoming, always making sure everyone was having a good time. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them told me they'd found a lot of evidence at Dan's house. They didn't go into further specifics, but they said he'd recorded things, videos, pictures, stuff he kept on his computer. It made me feel sick. The guy I'd thought was just a fun host was a predator, and I'd been in his house completely clueless. And I left the station feeling shaky. The whole drive home I kept thinking about how close I'd come to something awful. If I'd stayed longer, if I'd gotten in that hot tub, if I had one more drink, any of those things could have put me in danger. And I felt stupid for not seeing it, for thinking the party was just a good time. But more than that, I kept thinking about Steven. He'd been so insistent about leaving, even when I wanted to stay, and at the time I'd been annoyed, but now realized that he'd probably saved me from something horrible. I texted Steven as soon as I got home, asking if we could talk, and he came over that afternoon and I told him everything the police had said. And he looked pale, like he was just processing all of it too. I asked him why he'd been so set on leaving the party, and he said he didn't know Dan, but something about him felt off. He couldn't explain it exactly. He said it was just a gut feeling based on the way Dan was acting. He was always hovering around the girls, pushing drinks on them and making them feel uneasy. He didn't want to scare me at the time, so he just said he was tired and wanted to go. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. I hugged him and thanked him. I don't know if he realized how much he'd done for me that night, so I was sure to let him know. In the weeks that followed, I kept up with the news about Dan, and it turned out his real name wasn't even Dan. It was like Chris or something, and Hot Tub Dan was just what people called him. The police found a ton of evidence on his computer, videos he'd taken of girls at his parties, some of them unaware they were even being recorded. It was disgusting. He'd been doing this for years, throwing these big parties, luring people in, and then taking advantage of them. The girl from our night wasn't the first. I felt so angry, but also so helpless. I kept thinking about her, wondering if she was okay and hoping that she had people to actually support her. Dan, or Chris, eventually went to trial a few months later. I wasn't called as a witness, but I followed the case online, and the evidence was just overwhelming, especially the stuff on his hard drive. He was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. It felt like justice, but it didn't erase what had happened, and I couldn't stop thinking about how lucky I'd been and how one decision had actually kept me safe. And after that, I saw Steven a lot. We started hanging out more and he became someone I trusted completely. I don't know if it was the intensity of that night or just how easy it was to be around him, but we obviously grew close. And I told him one day how grateful I was for what he'd done. He just sort of shrugged and said he was glad that we left when we did. That's Steven though, quiet, steady, and always looking out for me. And looking back, that night was kind of just a blur of fun and danger, a mix of naive excitement and a close call I'll never forget. I still love a good night out, obviously, but I'm more careful now. I trust my instincts and the people who have good ones. That night could have changed my life in the worst possible way, but thanks to Steven, it didn't. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also now have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below if you want to check it out. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if you find yourself in the cheese caves, be sure to delete my taxes.